Hello, everyone. I'm Hartford Healthcare's Tina Verona. Well, the Hartford Marathon is just a few days away this coming Saturday, and preparations are well underway here at the Hartford Healthcare Bone and Joint Institute. This team right here assembled are rehabilitation experts. They are pre and post-rate race stretching sponsor. And we're going to take your questions live and look at the best ways to prep for the marathon. If you're a runner, what you should be doing day one on Monday as we approach the marathon coming up at the end of this week. So here we have Peter Lucio, a sports psychologist. We also have Wendy Nichols, who's a physical therapist and runner of many marathons. And alongside her, to her right, is Chris Barrett, a dietitian and sports nutritionist. He too has taken part in many, many marathons. I have not. So we are going to start first with Peter. Peter, as a sports psychologist, mentally, what should runners be focusing on here Monday, 5 days out from the marathon?
Right. I think so. A lot of this is preparation, right? So getting a sense of what your personal goals are going into it, right? What are your personal times in terms of your training? Although a marathon is a race, right? Think of it, unless you're doing it, to qualify for an event or you're doing it professionally, think of it as your race, right? You have your own personal times, your own personal goals to focus on, right? When we focus on the performance of others, right, rather than the performance of ourselves, it can actually take away in events like this. Other things that I like to recommend for athletes, especially in endurance events where there's a lot of managing discomfort over a long period of time, is getting in touch with your why, right? So why are you doing this? Why is it important for you, right? And every one of those moments where that discomfort is revisiting you, which tends to happen over the course of however long a marathon tends to be for that particular person, reminding yourself again and again why you're doing it, why it's important for you.
And once you have that goal, then as you go along, it's easier to implement that mental strategy, would you say?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And what I recommend for almost all athletes I meet with, in an effort to teach them how to come back, is to practice meditating. Some of the best athletes of all time, Michael Jordan had a meditation coach. So many athletes now have meditation coaches, right? It really just helps us come back to the present moment.
Peter, I want to ask you, you've seen it many times with runners, maybe toward the end of the race, maybe like the 23rd to 24th mile, maybe they start cramping up even well before that. Mentally, how do you get yourself back in the race to push through to get to that finish line?
That's an excellent question. It's hard to answer that because some of that can be physiological. Chris and I were talking about this. If it's a true like hitting the wall experience or bonking, that has to do kind of like with glycogen stores, and when athletes are really pushing themselves over a significant period of time, the body just starts responding in a particular way. Muscle groups, your ability to recruit muscle groups and perform the way you want to gets reduced. And so a lot of it is preparation and some of what Chris will share. But in those moments, if an athlete does hit a wall, understanding what that is, being willing to walk, right? Walk that half hour if you have to get, to get yourself reset. If you have fuel with you, taking that fuel during that time, right? Trying to replenish as best as you can. And, in those moments, if it truly is a bonk or hitting the wall, that's not you giving up. It's kind of physiological at that point, and just being gentle on yourself because it's such a long time.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I think it's such a commitment too, is that these runners are training and preparing for months for this big day. How do you keep your mind focused?
I would come back to that. What is your goal? What is your purpose? Right? Because training for an event like this, like you said, can be so long. We can become very oriented to that crossing the finish line, and then we kind of lose sight of the little goals along the way, right? So setting small goals, training goals along the way that help you get a sense of accomplishment, right? Help you get a sense of, I'm doing better. I'm improving on my training goals. So it doesn't feel like it's just this drudgery along the way, right? I won't be satisfied until I'm at the end.
Right. Is it almost like a mind over matter type thing?
It can be, and sometimes it's not, and so some of it, of course, is with endurance sports. There is this pain management that comes with it. It's uncomfortable, right? and that's a skill set to be developed. But in those moments, I think it's harkening back on some of the tools that I mentioned in order to manage some of that discomfort.
Yeah, absolutely. We do. Peter, I have a question from Nicole. Is the runner's high a real thing?
Oh, absolutely, right? So, so there's well, we would probably have to delineate for Nicole what she means by runner's high, right? So there's being in the zone, which in the literature we call being in a flow state, right? And that's where kind of some of the parts of the brain that normally function when we're thinking kind of quiet down, and we're able to just really be present and be absorbed in the experience, and oftentimes that state's very pleasurable. But there's all sorts of biochemical changes that come as a result of participating in sport. The most famous biochemical is endorphins, right? And if we break down the word endorphin, it's endomorphine, right? It's kind of one of these really feel-good chemicals. And so when we're really engaged in sport, for the sake of this marathon running, right, our body's constantly being exposed to that experience, right? And it oftentimes can feel really good.
How do you keep that moment from lasting?
It typically doesn't last forever, right? That's why so many athletes train, right? Because it's like sand through the hourglass or through the fingertips, right? It sticks with us for a little bit after we're done training or training, and then we want to revisit that. And that's what makes training so beneficial for some athletes, because it's kind of a way to feel good.
Peter, with 5 days away, mentally, what should runners be focused on at this point in the game? Mentally, what should they be focusing on?
I would say, trusting your training, that you've put in the hours, you've put in the time. This week is not the week to try to ramp up anything. It's the week to settle in, take care of the body, right? And Chris and Wendy will talk about some of this, but, nourish the body, eat things that feel good to your body. And then from a mindset perspective, I would say practicing things help you relax, right? Oftentimes when it comes to the race day, most people don't have trouble getting up and excited. It's the opposite. They're getting so excited that they feel like, they're not panicking, but they're getting to a point where it feels uncomfortable. And so it's practicing ways to relax, visualization, ways to calm down during this week.
Yeah, and what about for first-time marathon runners too? A lot will be taken to a half marathon for the first time ever, and maybe for some it'll be their first full marathon. Let's talk about stress levels, and how do you reduce stress levels, especially a lot of the anxiety for first-time runners, and they don't know what to expect.
Yep, that's an excellent question. That's a really important question in terms of how we think about endurance training or events like this, where the body's being asked to do so much, and anything that's taken away from that, including worrying, is sapping the body of energy it could be utilizing for performing, right? We know that one of the major utilizers of glucose in the body is the brain, and so if the brain's going, thinking, worrying, right, that's taking away our capacity to perform, right? But for entry-level athletes, I would say, just doing your best to think about how can I make this fun for myself, right? How can I tailor it to where I am as an athlete, especially if I'm a novice, not expecting you necessarily going to take first, unless you're training professionally, but how to make it fun for yourself, I think, is super important. And that can help take some of the stress and the worries off. But also, for some people, it's going to take a look at the course, going to see what they can be expecting, if there's a lot of elevation changes that can catch athletes off guard. But taking a look at the course, familiarizing yourself with it, and doing your best relaxing beforehand. Some athletes, if you're a coffee drinker, maybe the day of the event, maybe you don't drink coffee or drink decaf because you understand that you're going to be already pretty worked up. And so those are some things to consider.
Right. We have another question. As you're going through tapering leading up to the marathon, how do you mentally get over the fact that your longest distance was a week ago?
So some of that, I think, that could be helpful is, kind of a physiological understanding of the body, right? The idea that the body's going to hold on to that and trusting that, and that whatever you expose the body to in terms of training that week is really not going to be a significant adaptation to change your times necessarily. And so I think, some of it is, like I said earlier, is just trusting that you put in the time. I think for, the previous question was for newer runners. It's kind of some of that as an athlete as you mature is trusting your training program, right? That you've put in the hours, you've put in the time, and the body has made the adaptations that you've asked it to.
I think mentally too, for maybe more experienced marathon runners, will probably have this down pat, but inexperienced marathon runners or half marathon runners may not know the mental aspect of the endurance part of this and the mental part of it. What would you suggest for inexperienced runners to sort of prepare themselves mentally to get in that zone and to not let anxiety or stress take over?
Sure, I'm a big fan of the concept called bracing, which essentially means that we don't want to go into an event like this assuming that things are going to be easy. And so it's assuming that there are going to be challenges there, right? That when we brace, when we imagine that there are going to be challenges there, they don't blindside us, right? Setting realistic goals, like we talked about earlier, in terms of your performance, right? Not measuring yourself up or trying to stick with the pack. That can be problematic for early athletes. That there's going to be a pack of athletes who just kind of take off, and if you're new, you probably want to stay back and just find your pace and stick with it. And in terms and can you restate the question again, just to make sure I'm answering it?
I would say just mentally, how do they, inexperienced runners, prepare themselves mentally for that anxiety that they're going to face on that race day that they have no experience up until now until they get in that race?
Right. So experienced athletes are likely training this skill set throughout their off season, right? So just as an experienced athlete is putting in the hours on the treadmill or putting in the hours, pounding the pavement, they're also, spending time figuring out what helps them relax and practicing that. It's a skill set to be practiced in terms of learning how to manage that anxiety and learning how to relax. So it's something that a person can practice daily, in terms of either before their training or after their training, to help them get a better sense of what's going to help them manage that physiological arousal that comes with, a game day or a race day. And then practicing that every single day. Is it yoga? Is it deep breathing? Is it imagery? Is it meditating like I shared earlier? But really figuring out what works for you and programming it just like you would program your fitness.
What about distractions on race day? So, you're practicing, you're maybe running on the streets, but you're in a different zone. You're not in the race. But race day, there's a lot of distractions. There's people running past you that might get you a little, nervous, like I need to catch up. How do you deal with the distractions from a mental standpoint?
I would actually frame that a little bit differently, in that distractions are often good, right? The idea that you're going to be pushing yourself, and that those distractions are kind of a novelty to the mind, so they can distract away from some of the discomfort and challenges that get presented during the race. And then one of the things that, if it's a race or an event like this where there's going to be people watching, people cheering, do your best to kind of absorb that and make that and allow to feed off that energy as an athlete, rather than kind of being tunnel vision, because what can make it so fun is that people are there to support you, right? And perhaps even calling upon a support group for yourself, friends, family, who you could ask to come down, who either meet you at the end or meet you in the middle or meet you, at different points all along. But, I would say distraction can actually help in an event like this, because what can be so challenging is getting bogged down in the discomfort that comes with it.
Peter, let's focus on after the marathon. Let's say you complete the race, you didn't do as well as you thought you would. You didn't place where you wanted to. Your time is off. Maybe you didn't qualify for the Boston Marathon, and so you're let down a little bit. Mentally, how do you deal with that?
So especially an athlete who's trying to qualify, I would say there's a natural disappointment that comes with that, and that's normal and natural, and being willing to just ride that out, I think is important, and not necessarily trying to fight that per se. But there's an author, Carol Dweck, and she has a book called Mindset, and she delineates athletes' mindsets into either a growth-based or a fixed-based mindset. And a fixed-based is kind of more negativistic, right? That sees these disappointments as failures on the self, and can really be a barrier for athletes. And then there's kind of a growth mindset of, okay, I didn't place this year. What can I learn from this, right? Even though I'm disappointed right now, what can I extract from this experience so that when I approach this again later in the year, if I want to qualify for an event, or next time around, how do I tailor my training? How do I tailor how I approach the event in and of itself to make it an outcome that's closer to what you want?
And make it a fun experience.
100%, 100%. Especially if you're not a professional athlete, we want to make this as fun as possible. Right.
Peter, thank you so much. We appreciate it for joining us. Now that we're in the mindset, days away from the marathon, let's talk about some stretching. Let's talk about some real preparations in terms of the physical part of this. And Wendy Nichols, thank you so much for joining us. This is your area. So again, 5 days away from the marathon. I know that you're training for it too. What are you doing, and what do you recommend other folks be doing right here this Monday?
Well, for the last couple of weeks, you've been tapering down your training schedule. So really, you're not going to be running as much as you have been, but you want to keep up with the stretching because you're going to get tight as you go through the days. And if you don't keep up with flexibility, that can really hinder your performance on race day.
And when you say tapering down, how far down do we need to pump the brakes here, if you will?
It really depends on the training schedule that you're doing. Some people with a full marathon training schedule, the last run you do is about 10, 12 miles. And, that can, as Peter mentioned, really, play with you mentally, but understand that you put the training in, and you have to trust that training, just as Peter had said.
And so 5 days leading up to the marathon now, what should be your sort of daily regimen as we go forward, looking forward to race day?
Stretching, stretching, stretching. Chris will talk to you in the nutrition, the hydration, everything that you've done up until this point, you want to keep doing. You don't want to change anything because you don't know how your body's going to react to any of those changes. So you want to do exactly what you've been doing from day one with your training schedule.
Now, I know that you guys will be out there on the marathon day from the Bone and Joint Institute. We'll have the stretching tent. So you guys will be out there helping runners prior to the race. And I think it's important to mention after the race, because you've got to stretch after the race as well, especially if you're cramping up during the race.
Oh, absolutely. I think the post-race stretching is just as important as the pre-race stretching. It helps with that delayed onset of muscle soreness that you'll experience for days afterwards. It reduces the number of days or the amount of time that you're going to have that soreness. So post-race stretching, definitely come and see us, and you'll get to relax and lay on a table and let someone stretch you.
Give a little preview now. We've talked about stretching. Can you show us some examples of what kinds of stretches runners should be doing at this point?
So the two that I can show you is one's for the hamstring. It's called the monster walk, and it's very easy. I'll show you from the side because it's a lot easier. All you do is go this way. Yep. Opposite arm to opposite leg, and you're just going to.
And how many of these should you be doing?
About 10, 20.
A day?
Yep, a day.
Just up to the race.
Correct, just to keep your hamstrings nice and flexible. A lot of times where you're getting the cramping is your lower leg, which is the calf muscle. The hamstrings can most definitely seize up on you while you're running. And the quads too. If it's a very hilly race, those quads they'll let you know.
Yeah. Okay. And the second one?
And the second one is for the quads, which I mentioned is another one. So very easy. It creates. You need a little bit more balance for the quads, but it's the same idea that you're holding on and you're coming down.
And so this is good for balance.
It's for balance, but also for the quads. You're going to stretch out the quads as well as the hip flexors, which are very important.
And again, repetitions 10 to 20, would you recommend? Yep. And this is right up until even the day of.
Even the day of, even the morning of, because you want to make sure that you're nice and loose when you're going into the race.
And how do you know you're ready? How do you know your muscles are not going to cramp up? Is there any way to know that?
Unfortunately, no. As Peter mentioned, a lot of it has to do with the physiological changes that happen within the body, whether you're running a 5K, a half marathon, a full marathon. The body reacts differently, and it starts to break down after a while.
About hot versus cold in terms of muscle preparedness, and even prior to before after race. What is it? Is it hot or cold, or is it both?
Probably both. So afterwards you're going to have, especially for the longer races, you're going to have that inflammatory process, which means that cold is probably going to be your friend. But after that, the heat is probably going to be your friend more so than the cold, because it's going to help to loosen up the muscles, and you're going to be sore after an event.
And we talked with Peter about first-time runners to maybe this is their first marathon or first half marathon, what do you recommend they do at this point? Anything more or anything different?
First, first time runners, you want to make sure that you are familiar with the course. Peter mentioned it. You want to make sure that you have those landmarks that as you're running and going through the course, you're like, okay, so that's another mile. I remember this landmark. That's going to help you mentally get through it as you're going.
And then would you recommend they run certain portions of the race?
Some people do, but some people do it before as part of their training program, so they're familiar with, the inclines, the declines, the turns. They know what's coming up, and that helps them mentally prepare too.
And what happens if you are cramping up during the race and you're determined to cross that finish line? What do you recommend they do if you immediately start? Do you recommend them stopping?
You start walking. Start walking first. If it's not easing up, try a very, very gentle stretch. You don't want to overdo it because that will help it or make it go into more of a spasm if you overstretch it. But start with walking. Try and get the body back to where you need it to be and get everything to just calm down. And then try and restart again.
What types of injuries do you typically see following either a half marathon or a full marathon race? And is it mostly because of a lack of stretching?
It could be lack of stretching or the body just breaking down. When you're doing a marathon training program, the most you'll run is 20, 21, 22, maybe even 23 miles. If you're stopping at that 20-mile mark as your longest run, that's an extra 6 miles. So the body can break down at that point depending on what your training schedule has been like. Really just you just have to trust your training at the end of the day is what it comes down to.
The last 6 miles could make all the difference in the world. So how far should runners be running, say, today if they're training? How far should they be running?
You really just want to get a couple miles in a couple times this week just to keep loose and keep the body muscle memory. You want the body to remember what it's got to do.
And other types of stretches to avoid injury, because typically you do see a lot of hamstring injuries and
just a lot of cramping is what you see. The overworked muscles. That's typically what we'll see at the end of the race. We'll have a lot of people come through and they're just sore and they're cramping up, and coming to see us and have us do the post-race stretching helps out. It really does.
I know we're going to talk to Chris about the nutrition part of it as the third component, but the post-stretching, what does that entail? What are you guys going to be doing out there?
Well, luckily for the runners, they get to lay down. They've done all the work. Now it's time for us to do the work for them. So they'll get to lay on a table and we'll take them through a series of stretches, which will just help to loosen them up. And most times when people get up, they say, I feel great. I feel so much better than when I did when I lay down.
What about the following day, though? What can they expect? Can sometimes this be a delayed reaction and come in a day or two later? You could feel great at the end of the race, but then it may hit you 24 hours later.
Not even. It's probably an hour or two later when you drive home and you go to get out of your car and you're like, ooh, that doesn't feel so good. You're just going to feel a lot of stiffness, a lot of tightness, just soreness. Going up and down the stairs is when you're going to feel it the most. From going from a sitting to a standing position, that's not going to be nice on the legs, but it's just going to be some soreness, and it'll take a couple days to work that out.
And you've run in several marathons. What's your advice to first timers running the race for the first time this week?
Enjoy it. You've put the work in. You just have to go out there and just enjoy it. There's going to be people out there cheering you on. Just take it all in. Some people wear headphones, other people don't. I personally don't, because I like to look around and, engage with the supporters who are out there on the course.
Should you be looking at your watch? Should you be, and I know it's probably hard, like, hey, I've got to keep my pace up. If I'm going to do this in a record time, I need a 6-minute pace or a 7-minute pace. What should you be doing in terms of, do you not do that, or does it depend?
Just looking at your pace and seeing where you're at. If you can make those adjustments, if you're a little slower than you thought you were going to be and you're able to make those adjustments physically, then go ahead and make those adjustments. If you're not, if you're just tired and it's not a great race day for you, then you just do whatever you can to keep going.
Wendy, sort of take us through, if let's just say you're running the full marathon. Take us through. So mile marker, the first 4 miles, what should you be doing? Is it slow and steady? Is it sprinting? Is it sort of take us through the course and what you should be doing?
So right out of the gate, A mistake that a lot of people make is you go out way too fast. You have that adrenaline going. There's so much excitement at the start of the race, and you get caught up with what everyone else is doing, and you may not have started where your pace is, where you anticipate your pace to be. So you get caught up, and sometimes you just start out too quickly, and that can make for a very long run if you're running, any race really. So I recommend definitely keeping an eye on your watch. If you're wearing a watch that you can track your pace, keep an eye on that for the first couple miles until you can settle down into the pace that you're comfortable with. After that, it's just doing what you can. You have to pay attention to how your body's feeling and reacting, and you just go with however you're feeling in that moment. Towards the end is where, a lot of times that is the most challenging. Between mile 22 to 26, that's where I tend to hit the wall, and just pushing through, just knowing that you're almost there. You've come so far, and you only have a little bit left to go before you've crossed that finish line.
And do you recommend if you do start hitting that wall or if you do start cramping up, you stop and stretch?
Start walking first. Yeah, start walking first. See if you can kind of get your body back together, loosen it up just from walking. If not, then try a gentle stretch. See if that helps. If that helps, then try walking again and then slowly get back into a jog.
So your last minute advice to runners this week leading up to it, it's exciting. Everybody's really preparing. I mean, it's almost showtime. What's your advice?
Try and stay calm. Enjoy every moment. Enjoy the excitement, the experience. The expo is so much fun to go and get your packets and your bibs. And we'll be at the expo too on Thursday and Friday. So if you have any questions for us, please come and see us, and we'll be able to answer it as best we can. But just enjoy it. You've put the work in, so just go through this week. Know that you are ready, and that all the excitement and everything that you're going to go through it's just a fun experience.
Nichols, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate that. I know you're going to be out there, and good luck running this year. And we're going to bring in Chris Barrett, a dietitian, nutritionist, anything you want to know about eating. So, Chris, I know you've run a few marathons yourself. Are you running this year?
No, I'm not running this year. Nope.
Taking a break this year. All right. So you're going to be on the sidelines. You're going to be making sure people are, hydrated nutritionally. Here we are Monday, 5 days out. What should people be focused on in terms of eating? Loading up on the carbs still, or we slow it down?
I say one big thing I would say for most athletes is don't try anything new. So don't really overeat.
Seems to be the general theme, like no new sneakers.
No new socks, no new shirts, basically nothing new. And this sort of goes for your diet as well. If you know it works for you, so what you've been doing in training with your long runs, that would be something I would sort of consider to do during race day, right? We do need a little bit more carbohydrates, but I don't think overdoing it is really that important.
So right now, let's take us through breakfast, lunch, and dinner. What should runners be, whether they're doing the half marathon or full marathon, what should they be eating?
So breakfast is something I like to say is like a tried and true meal. So basically that's something works for you, something that is not going to upset your stomach, right? That was my biggest fear going into my first marathon, right? Just making sure I didn't have any stomach problems. So looking at that, I think, is the most important thing. Whatever you did for breakfast before all of your long runs, before all of your workouts, things like that, that's what you want to do the day before the marathon. Same thing for lunch. You want to keep it sort of small. And then dinner sort of, again, a little bit smaller too. So I would say we've typically heard of like carbohydrate loading. Have you heard of that before, or carb loading?
Yeah, we actually have a question. In high school, this is from Nicole, I would have pasta parties before sports games. Is carb loading a good thing?
So I think pasta parties are awesome for high school kids because it builds camaraderie, right? Number one, and sort of that social belonging. Carbohydrates are very important, especially for marathon runners. So making sure that you have carbohydrates throughout the day, not loading them up all at dinner time.
And Chris, does this depend on your weight? How much carbs should one be intaking?
Yeah, so I'm actually very fortunate. I actually have one of the runners who I'm actually working with here at the Bone and Joint Institute. He's actually running his first marathon. And he came to me and asked, what should I be having before, after, during my race? Yeah. And it is mostly carbohydrates. Right. So yeah, carbohydrates are your main fuel source. When we're trying to sort of run these distances at a higher intensity.
And what about when it comes to sodium and it comes to that and sugar? Yeah. What should we...
Yeah, so both sodium and sugar, right? Or excuse me, sodium and sort of carbohydrates in the form of sugar would be sort of your best bet. Sodium actually helps carbohydrate get into your muscle. So we need some type of sodium. There's general nutritional recommendations, and then there's things that we need for athletes. So at this time, I think having a little bit of sodium is a good idea. One of the things that I personally recommend for athletes is sprinkle a little bit of salt on their meal sort of at night time before. So that last meal sort of at dinner time, just have a little bit of sodium on it, and then I think you'll be okay. Just a little sprinkle.
And then, so the night before, is it more of the same as this week leading up to it?
So we sort of similar to that question is we get a lot of carbohydrate like loading meals. Those are okay, but I personally would recommend the person having their largest meal at lunchtime the day before. So if the race is Saturday, so Friday lunchtime would probably be your biggest meal because your run is done, right? And you sort of like Wendy was saying, all of your training is already done. So your largest meal is sort of lunch the day before. So that way that we don't have any of those GI issues that I was sort of talking about before.
Yeah, which you do see, I'm sure, on race day.
For sure.
Let's talk about hydration, dehydration, overhydration.
Yeah.
What's your stand?
Yeah, so there's the real risk of hyperhydration, or basically hyponatremia, which is you basically dilute your body of all the salt, is a real sort of issue, especially when people are told to sort of drink water at every station or drink water in excessive amounts, right? So making sure that you mix and match sort of the drinks like the Gatorades, the sodium electrolyte beverages, if you've tried them before, to see how that sort of helps.
And so do you recommend water versus sports drinks?
So I would always say it's sort of in that sort of mentality that we said before, tried and true. So if you haven't done it before, I probably wouldn't recommend it now. The athlete who I'm actually coaching or helping with, he actually he's going to be bringing his own water bottle, and he's going to be meeting his dad sort of halfway through the race. So he can switch the water bottles and have sort of exactly what he wants.
And then sports drinks. Are you for sports drinks in terms of races like this? You hear both ways.
Yeah, I'm 100% sports drinks. Yeah, we need our carbohydrates in this type of race. Actually, the more sugar, the better, because it's going to get into our system a little bit quicker. And there's research that demonstrates people can absorb about 30 to almost about 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour, depending on the sports drink mixture.
So are you talking before or during or after?
During. Yep, during. Yeah. So, and again, one of the things I've worked on with this athlete is training your gut. So training your gut to absorb all of those nutrients and allowing your body to sort of get used to digesting all that fluid.
And what about on race day? Do you recommend eating breakfast? And what do you eat?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. So the reason why the wall hits people earlier is they usually don't fuel properly. So the physiological things that Wendy and Pete were talking about, those are the things that we sort of want to just install is you want to make sure you're eating something properly before. So personally, I would have 2 bagels before and a big bowl of oatmeal and a large Gatorade. That would be sort of my sort of pre-race sort of meal.
I do see some runners with belts on, and they do carry different things on there. Do you recommend that? And if so, what do you recommend?
Those are the personal preference. And I think whatever they trained with, that's exactly what they'd fill up with. So the athlete who I work with, he's using a special sports drink that he used and he really enjoyed. And he's going to hopefully do really well. I think he will.
So how many calories do you actually burn in a half marathon and marathon? How many calories do you
There's a lot of different factors. So it depends on the speed, it depends on the ambient temperature. So the more humidity, elevated temperature, things like that, as well as the effort level. So it depends on how high your heart rate gets.
So how, and I know everybody's different, so it'll all be different, but what should people be calculating in terms of, okay, if I weigh this amount, if this is my pace, how many calories am I burning? So what do I need to make up for that deficit?
Yeah, so that's very hard to do. So that's why they come to see me to individualize that plan for them. So the athlete who I'm working with, I'll give you an example. He's probably going to consume about 120 grams of carbohydrates over the course of 4 hours. Right? So the sports drink that he has it's more concentrated, but it's a special formulation that can be made just for him. So yeah, so for him hopefully it's going to work out really well because he's been training with it, but he's going to be absorbing for each 2-hour period about 80 grams of carbohydrates.
Wow.
Yep.
Okay. And then following the race, what should you be eating?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So I think there's 2 trains of thought with this. if you're just training and it's your first marathon, you don't really need to worry about recovery. Enjoy it, right? Because you're not going to be training again for that long. But if you're somebody who's really competitive and want to get back out there within like the next 2 weeks, right? I would sort of say you can sort of consume your protein and carbohydrate-rich beverages, and that'll definitely help.
And then sort of coming off of the race, though, you sort of almost have to build your body back up because you're consuming many more carbohydrates than you typically would.
Right.
So is it a gradual buildup after the race?
No, I don't think it is. I think what you'd actually want to do is you'd probably want to have a significant amount of carbohydrates after the race. Because, again, you just went through all of that, right? You've used a lot of your glycogen stores, the stored form of carbohydrates, right? So you definitely need to replace those carbohydrates that you're using. Yeah.
All right. Chris, you're going to be out there on race day, right?
Yeah, hopefully, yeah. I'll be out there.
All right. Well, Chris, we appreciate all the tips and all the nutrition. You for joining us out there as well. I'm Hartford Healthcare's Tina Verona. We hope to see you at the Hartford Marathon this Saturday.